The Galactic Empire had sealed Earth's fate when they slaughtered Admiral Nolan Kennedy's 16-year-old daughter. Now they would face humanity's vengeance as we unleashed the most powerful warships ever built. Nolan stood rigidly on the bridge of the TCS Retribution, fists clenched, staring out the viewport at thousands of angular Terran battleships floating in formation around the crimson supergiant Antares. The vast armada bristled with weapons poised to strike. "Sir, the Benzite delegation has arrived," a junior officer said nervously. "They're requesting permission to come aboard under a flag of truce." Nolan's jaw tightened. Those Imperial bastards had the audacity to talk peace after obliterating an unarmed Terran merchant ship in cold blood. He had watched the footage in horror as the Aurora was ruthlessly destroyed along with the cadets on board, including his daughter Zora. Her death would be avenged. The Benzite ambassador, Weeson, strutted onto the bridge flanked by two hulking insectoid guards, compound eyes glinting. "The Galactic Empire does not answer to provincial upstarts," Reason declared imperiously. "Limit yourselves to your home system, or face the consequences." Nolan gripped his command chair, knuckles white, holding back the urge to tear the arrogant alien apart with his bare hands. "You have one Terran day to hand over those responsible for the Aurora massacre and withdraw all Imperial forces from our space," he said, voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Or what? You'll attack us with this minuscule fleet," Weeson scoffed. "The Empire could annihilate your pitiful Earth without even trying. I suggest you grovel for forgiveness instead." A cold smile spread across Nolan's face. The Benzites had no idea what was coming. Humanity would never again cower before alien oppressors. "Helmsman, take us out beyond the far orbital marker," Nolan ordered. "It's time to show the galaxy what real Terran power looks like." As the Terran fleet passed the orbital marker, Nolan gave a curt nod to his communications officer. The young man hastily typed in a coded message. Classified data packets streamed out from the Retribution toward Earth. On the view screen, Reason's face twisted in confusion and anger as a priority alert flashed across his display. "What is the meaning of this trickery?" The ambassador sputtered. "Our scouts report 2 million Terran warships just materialized above the throne world. Where did you hide an armada of that size with dreadnoughts and supercarriers from the Dissolution Wars era?" Nolan chuckled darkly, a vengeful glint in his eyes. "Did you really think we would leave ourselves defenseless? 3 millennia ago, when your kind formed the first fledgling empire, a visionary human foresaw the existential threat you posed. He preserved our greatest weapons in pocket dimensions, to be summoned by retribution warrants like myself in humanity's darkest hour." Weeson paled, his earlier bravado evaporating. The Benzites started blustering threats and ultimatums, but Nolan slashed a hand across his throat. The view screen went black as the comm link terminated. "Activate the wormhole generators," Nolan commanded. "It's time to bring the fight to the enemy." A low reverberated through the Retribution's hull as swirling blue portals yawned open, enveloping the Terran fleet. The angular battleships plunged into the wormholes, vanishing from Antares. Nolan turned to his executive officer. "Raise, give me a sitrep on the Throne World Theater." The lanky XO consulted a tactical holo. "Planetary shields are down, sir." Imperial point defenses were formidable, but couldn't withstand sustained bombardment from the graviton ram cannons. The palace complex has been reduced to a molten crater along with the High Council pyramid. Sadly, the dreadnoughts took heavy losses before the shields fell. Nolan gazed at the carnage impassively. The Imperial family and their lackeys had paid for their crimes against humanity. "Dispatch the reserves to capture the Empire's shipyards before they can organize a counter-offensive," he said. "We'll choke off their reinforcements at the source." Reyes saluted and moved to relay the orders. Moments later, the Retribution shuddered as it emerged into normal space above the Benzite homeworld. Sirens wailed plaintively across the planet's surface, the population only now realizing the mortal danger they faced. As the Terran fleet settled into low orbit around the Benzite homeworld, a firestorm of panic erupted on the planet's surface. Streams of shuttlecraft and escape pods fled the cities, only to be swatted from the sky by precision railgun fire. The few benzite frigates that rose to challenge the human ships were instantly vaporized by graviton beams. Nolan watched the chaos unfolding on the view screen, feeling nothing. Where families once lived and laughed, there was only destruction. He recalled how Zara used to pepper him with excited questions whenever he sent back images of glowing nebula and alien vistas from the fringes of explored space. Her eyes would go wide with wonder as she soaked up tales of his adventures. Now those eyes were forever closed, snuffed out by benzite brutality. A pulsing alert dragged Nolan back to the present. Reese's face popped up on a secondary display, expression grim. "Sir, long-range scans have picked up a flotilla of benzite-heavy transports trying to flee the system. Trajectory and omissions suggest they're carrying high-value targets, possibly the surviving leadership." Nolan felt a spike of rage. Weason and his ilk were trying to scurry away like rats from a sinking ship, hoping to hide in some bolt hole until the storm passed. They thought they could escape judgment. "Not on my watch," Nolan growled. "Order the interdiction cruisers to activate their gravity well projectors. Let's see how far they get with a few localized black holes in their path." Reese nodded and barked commands into his headset. On the tactical display, a dozen blue triangles representing the cruisers broke off from the main fleet and burned hard for the fleeing transports. One by one, the benzite ships vanished from sensors as they engaged their hyperdrives, only to be violently dragged back into real space, caught in the unbreakable grip of artificial gravity wells. "Transports immobilized, Admiral," Reese reported, a hint of savage satisfaction in his voice. "Shall I order the fleet to open fire?" Nolan hesitated. It would be so easy to obliterate the helpless ships with a single salvo, to snuff out the architects of humanity's suffering in one glorious instant. But that would be too quick, too merciful. His daughter had been denied any shred of mercy. "No," Nolan said, his voice cold and hard as vacuum. "Dispatch marine assault teams to secure those vessels intact. I want prisoners. The galaxy will see benzite leadership answer for their crimes in a court of law. Let them feel the crushing weight of justice that they so arrogantly flouted." As the first Terran assault pods latched onto the battered benzite hulls like parasitic wasps, another alert chimed on the comm panel. Reese skimmed the report, his frown deepening with every word. "Sir, we have a situation. It appears the regional governors are abandoning the Empire en masse. With the homeworld in our hands and their fleets in tatters, they're falling back to their personal fiefdoms and digging in." Nolan pulled up a hollow of the Galactic Empire's once vast domain. Like cracks spider webbing across a pane of glass, the map was now divided into a myriad of feuding factions as the governors carved out their own pocket empires. Each warlord had a stranglehold on their sector's resources and populace, transforming them into fortified bastions against outside aggression. In a matter of hours, the monolithic Galactic Empire had shattered into 100 jagged shards. From a strategic perspective, this development was both blessing and curse. Sowing chaos in the enemy ranks would make it easier to subdue each splinter faction in turn, like a lion culling a herd of weakened prey. But Nolan knew that even a cornered animal could be deadly when fighting for survival. Rooting out every last petty tyrant would embroil the Terran fleet in a grueling campaign of attrition costing untold lives and ships, and even if they emerged victorious, even if humanity ground the benzites to dust and took their place as masters of the stars, it would never erase the pain. It would never fill the yawning void in Nolan's soul, where his bright, beautiful daughter once resided. Vengeance was cold comfort against the unending ache of grief. The comm panel chimed a third time, the alert signal blinking crimson. Riz looked up sharply from his console. "Delphi just forwarded a burst transmission from the recon drones we left in Throne World orbit. You're going to want to see this now." With trembling fingers, Nolan opened the file. Zara's face filled the screen, her hair tangled and uniform torn, but unmistakably alive. Nolan's legs nearly buckled with relief. "Dad, I don't have much time," Zara said urgently. When the Aurora was hit, a few of us made it to the escape pods, but our pod was intercepted by Kulrathi slavers. Nolan's relief turned to dread. The Kulrathi were a ruthless species known for exploiting the misery of the Empire-Terran War, growing rich by trading in flesh and contraband. They've taken us to a hidden slave depot in the Gorgon Nebula. You have to hurry. They're already Zora's image dissolved into static. Set course for the Gorgon Nebula immediately, Nolan barked. Maximum burn. The fleet lurched into motion, the Retribution's powerful engines training at the limits of their endurance. Nolan paced the bridge restlessly, each second feeling like an eternity. 10 hours later, the fleet decelerated at the outskirts of the Gorgon Nebula, a vast cosmic maelstrom of swirling gas and electromagnetic storms. Active scans were useless in the celestial miasma. Switch to passive sensors only, Nolan ordered. Look for any gravitational anomalies, neutrino emissions, anything that might indicate a hidden base. The bridge crew worked feverishly, probing the roiling nebula with every detection method available. Nolan forced himself to breathe evenly, to focus past the fear clawing at his heart. "Admiral, I'm picking up an unusual concentration of silicate particulates in orbit of the third moon of GRS 1739, a sensor tech called out. Spectral analysis shows refined metals mixed in could be debris from ship activity. Helm, get us there now," Nolan snapped. As the fleet approached the green-tinged gas giant, a spread of plasma bolts lit up the void, hammering into the Retribution's shields. Red threat icons blossomed on the tactical display as batteries of surface-to-space cannons emerged from concealed emplacements on the moon's cratered surface. "All ships, evasive pattern Delta 5. Nolan shouted over the din of impact alarms. "Get our Marines in drop pods. I want that base taken out." Scores of armored pods, little more than re-entry shells packed with battle-hardened Terran warriors, erupted from the Retribution's launch tubes and plummeted toward the moon. Plasma blasts tore through the pod formation, burning men to ash. But the survivors landed with grim determination, storming out with rifles blazing. Nolan gripped the arms of his command chair hard enough to leave dents in the metal as he watched the Marines dig in, trading fire with the base's fanatical defenders. The Kulrathi fought with the desperate savagery of cornered predators, inflicting grievous losses, but the Terrans pressed on, driven by the cold fury of comrades butchered above the throne world. After an eternity of bloody attrition, the base's defenses crumbled. Nolan rose on shaking legs, a leaden weight in his gut. "Commander Rees, you have the con. I'm going down there." The acrid stench of scorched metal and charred flesh assaulted Nolan's nostrils as he strode into the captured base, flanked by a squad of Marines. He barely noticed the bodies littering the blasted corridors, so focused was he on finding his daughter. A flicker of movement in a side chamber drew Nolan's attention. He shouldered past the guards and froze at the threshold. Zara lay on the blood-slicked floor, her broken body cradled in the arms of a young man. Nolan recognized the cadet's uniform. Kai, the boy Zara had mentioned in her letters, the one she had dreamed of exploring the stars with. Nolan knelt beside them, reaching out with a trembling hand to brush a strand of hair from Zara's face. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain. "Dad," she whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of her mouth. "You came." "Of course I did," Nolan choked out. "I'll always come for you." Kuzara smiled faintly. "I knew you would. I love you, Dad. Don't let this be for nothing. Don't let them win." Her eyes drifted shut, and she went still, a last breath shuddering from her lungs. Nolan gathered her limp form to his chest, a wordless howl of grief and rage tearing from his throat. "She led the captives in a revolt when your fleet arrived," Kai said hoarsely, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "Saved dozens of lives, but the Kulrathi overseer gunned her down." A cold, merciless clarity descended over Nolan, the universe narrowing to a single inexorable purpose. He reached for his comm link. "This is Admiral Kennedy. I'm invoking Directive Omega-3. Deploy a Nova Bomb on the Kolrathi homeworld. Stunned silence greeted his words, then Rai's voice filtered through tight with concern. Sir, Omega-3 is only to be used as a measure of last resort to prevent an existential threat to humanity. If we use it now, we'll be no better than the empire we fought to overthrow. They took my child, Nolan said, his voice leached of all emotion. They deal in misery and suffering. There can be no mercy, no quarter. Burn them from the stars. A shuddering boom echoed through the base as a miniature sun blossomed in the eternal night above the Kolrathi homeworld, an expanding sphere of nuclear fire scouring the planet's surface clean of life. Nolan watched the apocalyptic blast on the view screen, feeling nothing but a yawning emptiness. In the weeks that followed, as the Terran fleet mopped up the last holdouts of Imperial resistance, Nolan walked the halls of the Retribution like a ghost, going through the motions of command. But the fire that had driven him, the righteous cause that had sustained him through the long years of war had gutted out, leaving only ashes behind. On the day the last Imperial warlord bent the knee to Terran authority, Nolan summoned Rhys to his quarters. He removed the silver and gold insignia of a Retribution warrant from his collar and pressed it into her hand. The Empire is broken, but the galaxy still needs someone to guide it toward a better future, someone who hasn't lost their way. I'm done, Rhys. I can't be the leader humanity needs. Not anymore. It has to be you. Rhys closed her fingers around the insignia, a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. I'll do my best, sir, for Zara, and for all the others who sacrificed so much. Nolan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I know you will be better than I was, Rhys. Don't let vengeance consume you as it did me. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind the uniform and the life he had once clung to so fiercely. Years later, an aged Nolan sat on a rocky promontory overlooking an endless alien sea, the stars of a foreign galaxy glimmering overhead. He had wandered far in his self-imposed exile, desperate to outrun the ghosts of his past. But as he gazed up at the infinite expanse above, he couldn't help wondering if Zara's sacrifice had truly changed anything, if the new order he had helped to build would endure or crumble like the one before it, if humanity would find a path beyond the cycle of destruction and retribution that had consumed him. And on nights when the weight of regret pressed down on his soul, when the memory of Zora's blood on his hands burned like a brand, Nolan wished he could go back to that fateful moment above the Benzite homeworld, to stay his hand from the course of total war and find another way, a path of justice tempered by wisdom, of peace bought through understanding rather than force. But the past was immutable, and he was left to bear the bitter fruit of the choices he had made, choices that had broken entire worlds and shattered his own soul beyond repair. As a shooting star arced across the endless void, Nolan whispered a final apology to the daughter he had failed, to the man he once was. Then he closed his eyes, letting the cool night breeze carry away the tears he could no longer hold back, a final silent benediction to a life forever stained by the ashes of war. The years slipped by like grains of sand through an hourglass. Rhys, now an admiral, led the Terran Confederacy's efforts to rebuild a fractured galaxy. She walked a tightrope between diplomacy and swift, decisive action against the most brutal warlords who refused to bend the knee. Nolan watched the new Golden Age take shape from afar, a silent observer withdrawn from the great game of galactic politics. He built a small homestead on a remote frontier world, a place where the only sound was the lonely whisper of the wind through alien trees. But even in this isolation, he couldn't escape the past. Memories of Zara, of the choices he'd made haunted his every waking moment like restless specters. One morning, as Nolan sat on his porch nursing a mug of bitter kefaya, a sleek Confederation shuttle descended from the lavender sky. It settled onto the packed earth with a hiss of hydraulics, kicking up a cloud of ruddy dust. Nolan squinted as the ramp lowered, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him, but the figure that emerged was no illusion. Kai, the young cadet who had cradled Zora in her final moments, strode down the ramp. His boyish features had hardened into the chiseled lines of a man who had seen too much too soon. The lieutenant's bars on his collar glinted in the harsh sunlight. "Admiral Kennedy," Kai said, his voice a somber rasp. "Ray's sent me. We need your help." Nolan scowled. "I'm retired, son. Whatever it is, it's not my problem anymore. I'm afraid it's everyone's problem." Kai held out a data pad, the screen flickering with dire reports. "A new threat has emerged from the unexplored rim. They call themselves the Vorix Imperium. They're sweeping through Terran space like a plague, enslaving entire worlds and leaving nothing but ashes in their wake." Nolan turned away, his jaw clenched. Humanity seems doomed to lurch from one war to the next, an endless cycle of violence and retribution. I wanted to believe we could be better than that. But maybe it's just our nature. Maybe it's all we're good for. Kai stepped forward, his eyes blazing with conviction. Zara gave her life fighting against that idea. She believed in a future where the strong protect the weak instead of exploiting them. If we give in to despair, if we let the Vorix run rampant, then her sacrifice meant nothing. Nolan felt a stirring in his chest, a flicker of the old fire that had once driven him to the edges of known space and beyond. He looked at Kai, seeing the ghost of the man he used to be reflected in those fierce, determined eyes. "All right," Nolan said at last, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll hear Rise out for Zara, if nothing else." The shuttle ride passed in tense silence. Nolan stared out the viewport, watching the stars streak by in blurred lines of light. When they finally dropped out of warp, he felt his breath catch in his throat. The Retribution hung in orbit above the shuttle, her hull scarred and pitted by the ravages of time and war. But even in this battered state, she was still a magnificent sight, a testament to the ingenuity and tenacity of the human spirit. Reese greeted Nolan in the hangar bay, her face lined with the weight of command. She clasped his hand firmly, her eyes searching his face for the man she once knew. "I wouldn't have asked you to come if the situation wasn't dire," she said without preamble. "The Vorix have pushed us back to Antares of all places, the site of our first great victory against the Empire, now our last line of defense." Reese led Nolan to the briefing room, where a holographic display of the Antares system rotated slowly above the table. Red icons representing the Vorix fleet blinked into existence at the edge of the system, vastly outnumbering the blue markers of the beleaguered Terran ships. "Their technology is like nothing we've ever seen," Reese said grimly. "Some kind of reality-bending weapons that can tear ships apart at a quantum level. Our conventional defenses are virtually useless." Nolan studied the display, his mind racing. The old thrill of the hunt, of pitting his wits against a worthy foe, thrummed through his veins like an electric current. In the days that followed, Nolan threw himself into the battle preparations with a fervor that surprised even himself. He pored over the sensor logs, analyzing the Vorix fleet's every move. And then, in a moment of blinding clarity, he saw it. A complex but repetitive pattern in their formations, a dance of destruction that seemed to power their impossible weapons. "There," Nolan said, stabbing a finger at the display. "That's the key. If we can disrupt their formation at these critical junctures with precisely timed gravity well pulses, their own weapons will tear them apart from the inside out." Riz nodded slowly, a grim smile spreading across her face. "It's a hell of a gamble, but it's the best chance we've got." As the Vorix fleet bore down on Antares, the Terran ships moved into position. Nolan stood on the Retribution's bridge, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched the dance of the Vorix ships, waiting for the perfect moment. "Now," he barked, "all ships activate gravity wells." Space itself seemed to shudder and convulse as the Terran fleet unleashed their secret weapon. The Vorix ships shuddered and twisted, their hulls warping and buckling as their own reality-bending fields turned against them. In the chaos, Nolan saw his chance. He turned to Reese, his eyes blazing with a fierce, reckless light. "I'm going over there," he growled. "Zolgoth is mine." Before Reese could protest, Nolan was gone. leading a desperate boarding action onto the Vorix flagship. He fought his way through the alien corridors, his rifles spitting death with every step. And then on the shattered bridge of the flagship, he found himself face to face with Emperor Zolgoth himself. The alien warlord was a towering figure, his chitinous armor glinting in the hellish light of his dying ship. Zolgoth lunged at Nolan with a roar, his bladed arms slashing through the air. Nolan met him head-on, his rifle forgotten, his fists and feet lashing out in a brutal primal dance. They traded blows across the bridge, smashing through consoles and bulkheads, neither giving an inch. But Nolan could feel his strength waning, his body battered and broken by the relentless onslaught. With a last desperate surge of effort, he launched himself at Zolgoth, driving his combat knife deep into the warlord's neck. Zolgoth staggered back, black ichor gushing from the wound. He collapsed to the deck, his eyes dimming as the life drained out of him. Nolan slumped against the bulkhead, his vision blurring, his life bleeding out onto the cold metal floor. As he drifted towards the waiting dark, a figure appeared before him, glowing with an ethereal light. "Zara," Nolan whispered, his voice a ragged gasp. "If you finish this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says I like the story, and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time."